Hello, I'm Peter Herbert from Insight Training, and welcome to this month's short CPD webinar, which is going to focus on sustainability reporting. It's a topic we've covered quite a lot on courses the last 3 or 4 years. There have been some quite important recent changes, and we thought therefore on this month's session it would be useful to update you. And we're going to look at 3 steps really. We're going to think first of all about the requirements for streamlined energy and carbon reporting, SECA as we sometimes refer to it. It's been around for a while now, hasn't it? We'll then move on to think about the newly developed international sustainability standards. They were issued in June of 23. And then right at the end, a bit of a discussion about the implications of this whole agenda for disclosure in SME businesses. Okay, let's start off then with SECA, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting. Yeah, this has been around since periods commencing 1 April 19, so 31st of March 20 year ends. And as I'm sure a lot of you will know, fundamentally 4 things we have to disclose in the director's report effectively for a company which is large: energy consumption, related carbon emissions, an intensity ratio, and then information on initiatives to improve energy efficiency. Now, this is still relatively niche in the sense it only applies to large companies, so those that are breaching 2 out of 3 of 36 million turnover, 18 million gross assets and 250 employees. So yeah, although it is relevant to lots of companies, certainly for those operating within the SME space, it's less relevant. And right now, the regulations do not apply to the SME businesses in the same way that they do to those which are large. Now, I do see quite a few annual reports with streamlined energy and carbon reporting disclosure within. It's often, I must admit, quite uninspiring, the tabular information in the director's report, but some organisations, I would say, are really embracing it. I think very often you'll find not-for-profits do. So I've seen some really good disclosure in charity annual reports, housing association annual reports, and sometimes the organisations concerned will not actually be large. They'll be small or medium-sized. They'll be very keen to embrace the disclosure agenda in this area, and also embrace it in a really impactful way. This is an example from the annual report of Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing, making a real effort, I suppose, to sort of tell the story about the environment and their environmental performance in a more pictorial way to really make the disclosure more impactful, rather than a very boring table of numbers that really does resonate with very few. So it can be, in fact, impactful. It is impactful for some, but yeah, some organisations are really trying to embrace it. Others do the minimum. And when that's the case, I must admit the information concerned can be pretty uninspiring. Now, the FRC have certainly provided some feedback on their observations on those that have applied the streamlined energy and carbon reporting disclosure requirements already, particularly in FTSE 350 businesses. I thought it would be useful to give a bit of feedback from our side as to what we see when we're doing file reviews, look at annual reports in that context, and we then see some interesting stuff that we would occasionally challenge perhaps or find interesting in the relation to the way that those large companies have embraced it. We do occasionally come across situations where there'll be a complete lack of disclosure. Now, that is actually pretty rare. In fact, I saw an example in the summer of 23 where an audit firm was auditing a large company. Their client steadfastly refused to embrace the disclosure requirements at all, and the audit firm, and good on them, they'd chosen to modify their opinion in the audit report off the back of the fact that this particular company had not embraced relevant legislation by completely refusing to include the relevant disclosures in the director's report. Interestingly, when we do find the disclosure is there, and invariably it will be there, sometimes, although the information's there on the carbon emissions, you won't get the information on the actual basic energy consumption. Now, that's a point I've raised occasionally when I've seen these disclosures in practice. Sometimes a lack of comparative information that, of course, is really important to provide some context for the figures in the actual narrative report there. That's something which, again, sometimes we observe. The need, I would say, for auditor evidence where a client has chosen to use the less than 40 megawatt hours consumption per annum as the basis for exempting itself from disclosure in this area. What does that equate to? Well, I regularly read it equates to about 9 houses worth of electricity and 4 houses worth of gas. So we're not in any way, shape or form expecting audit firms to audit the numbers here. But I think if your client's looking to try and use the less than 40 megawatt hours per annum exemption as a workaround to not include the disclosure, you want a bit of information on your file as to why you think that's reasonable in the circumstances. And I would say also 3 or 4 years on, we do sometimes find that the disclosure around initiatives being taken to actually improve energy efficiency can be quite weak. I mean, my take on that one, I suppose, is that given that we're 3 or 4 years in now, and given this only applies to large companies, surely they can find something to say in terms of what they're doing to actually embrace, I suppose, the environmental agenda. I did see one the other week where the actual disclosure on initiatives looked like that. And to me, given this is, quite well established now and only applying to large companies, if that's the best you can do around initiatives, that to me feels quite poor. And I did make that point actually to the audit firm concerned when I was doing the file review. Okay, so that's a bit on streamlined energy and carbon reporting. Also to mention, we have got this thing called TCFD disclosure. So the TCFD framework, Task Force on Climate Related Disclosure. This is a requirement for larger corporates still. And if we're looking at, I suppose, private companies, if you take the sort of the listed companies out of the agenda, out of the equation here, take banks out of the equation, take insurance companies out of the equation, with effect from periods commencing 6th of April 22, very large companies with more than 500 employees and more than 500 million turnover, they will need to embrace this disclosure framework, which is talking again about, I suppose, governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets in relation to the sustainability agenda. Now that's rolled out from periods commencing 6th of April 22. But again, if you're working within an SME business, or you maybe as a firm of accountants are acting for SME businesses, streamlined energy and carbon reporting, as we mentioned in the first section of this particular session, is probably going to be relevant. Rarely a TCFD disclosure requirements, that's going to be required, even less frequently, given the sort of the threshold above which that disclosure needs to go in. Now, one thing that I know is sort of, I suppose, driving the agenda in terms of disclosure in this area is perhaps the need for a more joined up approach globally. And with that in mind, we've recently had, June 23, the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, publishing their first 2 standards for disclosure in this area. S1 that deals with general requirements for disclosure of sustainability related financial information, and S2 that deals specifically with climate related disclosure. There was, I think, quite an acknowledgement that perhaps globally the rules imposed by different jurisdictions were a little bit different, a little bit disjointed. There was therefore perhaps a need for a more global joined up approach. At the November 21 UN Climate Change Conference, the ISSB was formed to sit alongside the IASB that of course issues the International Financial Reporting Standards. And with that international body in place, I suppose some momentum then for having a more universal approach for disclosure of an issue which clearly is a universal issue. So those standards are now out there and formalised. The really key question, I suppose, from a UK point of view is, will these standards be embraced within the UK? Well, almost certainly. Within what timescale to be confirmed, and who will they apply to? Will the decision be taken to roll these standards out to smaller SME businesses, or will we just stick with large or very large ones? That's what we've got to keep an eye on, certainly going forward into the later part of 2023 and beyond, just to get a sense of how this will actually come into play within the UK. A little bit more detail on those standards. So S1, from an ISSB point of view, effective from 1 Jan 24, And that's about disclosure about sustainability related risks and opportunities more generally. Now, one of the points I've certainly seen some sort of hard feedback on in relation to S1 is perhaps it's not defined quite as well as it might what a sustainability related risk or opportunity might look like. It talks about the fact it's a risk, relating to sustainability that could impact on cash flow, that could impact on access to finance. And there are some examples, I think, in the appendix to the S1 here, which talks about the sort of things that could be relevant. It could be that you may be an organization where you very much depend on a natural resource, like, for example, water. And I suppose lack of access to water could be a very big risk as far as your business model is concerned. And that could be therefore a risk you talk about in your narrative report. It could be, on the other hand, that your really critical resource that you depend on is perhaps employee expertise, or just the availability and access to manpower generally. And again, the access to that particular resource and risks around being able to tap into it, again, could be a different sort of risk you might talk about within your narrative based on S1. And if you do identify any relevant risks that do require disclosure, then the way that's explained broadly aligns to the TCFD requirements that we saw briefly there on the previous slide. S2 is similar to S1, but that focuses more on risks specifically related to the climate agenda and less to sustainability more generally. And as the slide says, if you're embracing S2, what you're also going to incorporate into your narrative is information much along the same lines as what's required by streamlined energy and carbon reporting rules as well. So there we are, interesting observation around that sort of suite of two standards very much being out there. The million-dollar question now is, well, when will this apply within the UK? We expect endorsement of the S1 and S2 standard by July 24. They'll be called in the UK SDSs, Sustainability Standard Disclosures. Not quite clear at this point who they will apply to and in what time frame, but what seems really clear from what I've seen is they will not just apply to organizations that are applying IFRS. Let's just keep an eye on that, but want to certainly track over the next few months is to see in what timescale they will come in and exactly who they will apply to. Okay, now, as I think I might have mentioned at the start of the session, we want to talk a little bit, if we could, about the implication of all this sort of sustainability reporting agenda for SME businesses. As we've seen on the way through, quite a lot of the detailed rules as they currently stand don't formally apply to SMEs. And it can therefore, I think, sometimes take a bit of an effort to get SME businesses excited about this sort of stuff, and indeed accountancy firms that act for them. I wanted to signpost if I could a really good article published in the Financial Reporting Faculty of the ICAW's really useful, by all accounts, publication earlier this year, which consisted of a suite of articles looking at the whole sustainability agenda, the introduction of S1 and S2, and one particularly I've signposted here, which talks a little bit more in detail about the relevance of the sustainability reporting agenda to SME businesses and why they should care. So well worth a look if you're a chartered accountant at Sophie Parkhouse's really good article. And yeah, I guess points she makes are, first of all, it might be that although your organization is an SME business, I should say, if maybe it's providing goods or services to a larger corporate higher up the supply chain, they might need to embrace the sort of the range of disclosure requirements possibly imposed by TCFD. And what they might do, therefore, is to ask for information from the smaller SME businesses lower down the supply chain, to actually inform their disclosures at the higher level. So just bear that in mind. There might be a disclosure requirement imposed on you because you're part of a bigger supply chain at the top of which sits a larger company that's very much in scope. Very much encouraging organizations to embrace the disclosure here voluntarily, as we mentioned on that earlier slide. Talking to you a bit about something I've certainly come across, where you can have a situation, I feel, where if you're perhaps borrowing money these days, sometimes you'll find, depending on the nature of the facility, you might get perhaps a discount on the interest that you pay based on hitting certain environmental targets. I've certainly come across that in the housing sector. So that, again, I suppose does make this whole sustainability piece relevant to smaller businesses that could tap into that funding just as much as larger ones might be able to as well. Making people aware that in the smaller SME businesses, there will be future environmental regulations coming down the line. The article highlights the phasing out of gas boilers and zero emission HGV vehicles. So again, being very switched on to the regulations coming down the line, even though technically from a disclosure point of view, the SME businesses aren't yet in scope, and just wanting to make a difference, making that a real driver to put sustainability high up the agenda for SMEs, even though technically from a disclosure point of view, they're not currently in scope. So very worthwhile having a look at that article. And in addition to that, a further piece that I've commented on lots on courses in the last 2 or 3 years, a very excellent paper produced by the FRC a couple of years ago, Fact Sheet Age, which literally goes through FRS 102 section by section and articulates how the climate-related agenda will impinge on preparation of accounts using FRS 102 in these various areas. I've certainly found last 2 or 3 years that the environmental agenda is still, for many organisations, very much about the narrative disclosure at the front end of the annual report, but without doubt, the actual financial statements will start to feel the effect in the future as time goes forward. Some already are, and that really excellent paper, which will get updated, I'm told, as time goes on, literally takes each individual section of FRS 102 and just comments, how the agenda of the environment will impact going forward. So again, if you've not had a chance to have a look at that one yet, that is very well worthwhile looking at and keeping an eye on as time goes forward. Okay, so there we are. That's our session done. What have we done? We've started off with a practical look at some of the issues around streamlined energy and carbon reporting that affects large companies. We've had a quick look at international sustainability standards and the ISSB's work and how that will impinge on disclosure in this area going forward in the UK. And then right at the end then, a look at 1 or 2 implications for smaller SME businesses and a couple of quite useful resources to have a look at in that area as well. Hope you found that session useful. Any questions or queries, do drop us an email, inquiries@insight-training.co.uk. And for information on our full programme of events for autumn 2023, the website there, www.insight-training.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Hope that was useful, and I'll speak to you all again soon.